Welcome to the Step-by-Step Millionaire, where our job is to help you make money. And today we're going to be working on a completely different subject that's a little broader, but it's designed to help you see two things. Number one, why money markets and gold and silver fluctuate so dramatically, and where the center point of all of this is. Now, there's a saying, as the Middle East goes, so goes the money. So today we're going to be looking at the Middle East. We're also going to be looking at some of the way that the lamestream media manipulates what's occurring. And if you can see outside of this, it lets you get a better perspective on how you should be investing. So before we begin on this, there's two things that I'd like to point out. One, stick with us, because at the end of this video, I'm going to show you stuff that will shock you and that you will not find on the mainstream media. They just will not talk about this. So before we begin, you'll notice a yarmulke on my head. And the reason I'm showing you that is because I want you to understand that I do have a bias in this, but I'm going to attempt as much as possible to produce a balance and not to swing one way or the other. So today we're going to be talking about the Middle East, Israel, and the Arab countries around it, the UN, and this whole how it's going. And believe it or not, this will have a point as we go. So what we want to do is we want to start with a little history, back way up. We're going to have maps for you. So the first map we're going to pop up here is the map of Israel during the time of King David, King Solomon, in around there. So it gives you an idea, as you can see, how big the kingdom was at that time, all of the lands that were considered the land of Israel. Now, moving forward, the Romans conquered this area later on. 70 AD, 132, they basically took over all of the kingdom because the war was so vicious and so long. The head of Rome was super angry. He basically moved a lot of the wealthy Jews out and the families. They didn't completely remove all the Jews from the land. There's always been Jewish people who stayed in the land, mostly the poor. And then Rome was in charge of it. Now, it went through many wars all the way down this area that was renamed Palestine. And then that area became also known later on, which we'll get to, as Transjordan. So as we move down through history, the Ottoman Empire, to bring it to modern times, was in control of it during World War I. Ottoman Empire crumbled during World War I, and this area that was known as Palestine came under British rule. Now, this was never a country. This was an area owned by other people, so it was never a country of Palestine. And this is very, very important why I state that as we go. So to give you an idea, Palestine in 1882 had 24,000 Jews, which was 8% of the population, and then it had 276,000 Arabs, Christians, Baha'i, and others. So it gives you a mix. By 1947, there's 630,000 Jews and 1.3 million of the others. Now, during this time period, 1947 pre, everybody who lived there didn't call themselves Palestinians. There was no such title. If you asked people, and this is something that you can actually check into and read up. If you ask people, they say, I'm a Syrian Arab, I'm an Egyptian Arab, or the Jews would simply say that they were Jews, and they were living in the region of Palestine, which was also considered Lesser Syria, Lesser Jordan, depending on who you talk to. So that's the way it looked. Now, during World War I, there was a certain thing that the British did called the Balfour Declaration. And what the British did is they really set this whole problem up in the first place because they needed allies during World War I. So they went to the Jews and they said, you know what? You side with us, we're going to give you an area. And then they went to the Arabs and said, hey, you know what? You side with us, we're going to give you the area. And after World War I was over, the Balfour Declaration stated that the Jews had the right to a strip. Really ticked the Arabs off. But instead of the Arabs being angry at the British, they were angry at the Jews because during this time period, Zionism had started and the Jews had begun buying up a lot of land along the northern areas of Israel. So at that time, we'll pop this map up for you. This is the area of known as Palestine now, and this was in 1947 before it was divided up. Okay, now as I said before, at that time period, 630,000 Jews were there, 1.3 million of everybody else, Christians, Arabs, Baha'i, and anybody else who was there. Now, we're going to switch to the next map. This next map is the Balfour Declaration UN split. This is what they said. Now, you'll notice that the upper part of the map on this side is Israel, and then like there's this little teeny strip, and then down here, the lower area. So the Jewish population was offered 55% of the land, and the Arab population 45% of the land. Now that sounds like the Jews were getting a better deal, but on the map right here, the lower area, this is the Negev desert. Okay, it is desert. Nothing grows here. So basically the only habitable land was the upper part that you see in the map here. So the Jews weren't getting a great deal. The Arabs got most of the fertile land and everything. So the UN said, here's how we want to divide it. And they voted in 1948 to give the Jews the homeland, and the Arabs gave the UN one of these fingers and said, under no condition. So they did not accept this divide at all, and they didn't accept any of the land. Instead, they went to war.
The Jewish people at once began to celebrate the United Nations decision. If they hadn't got all they wanted, they had at least gained the verdict for the setting up of a new Jewish state, and their rejoicing was obviously a spontaneous affair. Such was the immediate Jewish reaction in Jerusalem, and it was the same in Tel Aviv and elsewhere. The Arab reaction was to follow. 2 days later, this was the typical scene. Arabs advancing on the center of Jerusalem at the beginning of a 3-day strike and an orgy of wrecking, looting and bloodshed. Isolated police were more or less powerless to deal with the riot, which beginning as a demonstration quickly led to the burning of Jewish shops and the general destruction of Jewish property.
Now, when they went to war, the Jordanians captured the area known as the West Bank, which you now know, so we can go to a more modern map now. The area that you see here, the West Bank, was captured by the Jordanians. Now, the Jordanians held that until 1988. Now, peace obviously came in multiple times. As you probably know, the Arab countries en masse tried to destroy the Jewish nation. And when I mean destroy, drive them into the sea, kill every man, woman, and child. So that was the point of the whole thing, kill every man, woman, and child. They didn't want peace, they wanted all of the land. They felt that that was their right. Now, in 1967, when all of the Arab countries tried to destroy the Jewish nation again of Israel, they lost. Again, big time, and in that time, the whole area of the West Bank was captured by Israel, plus the Golan Heights and some other areas, a large area of Egypt. When the whole thing was over, Israel was really nice. They gave Egypt back their stuff, and for some reason, they were willing to negotiate the land that was the West Bank for Palestinians, and they keep doing this. They keep negotiating for this land. Now, before we finish this little story off, I want to talk about some of the headlines to give you an idea of how this, for some reason, continuously gets done to make Israel look like the bad guys. And it boggles me, and the reason we're doing this video is I'm very curious why the mainstream media is so pro-Palestinian and so negative on the others, because you will always hear about the Palestinians that were forced out of their land in the original wars, and about between 700,000 and 800,000 Palestinians were forced or left, because they weren't all forced. Haganah only forced a specific amount of people out, and they became refugees in the countries around the area. What the media doesn't talk about, remember I said at a maximum 800,000, the UN's actual number from that time period was more like 360,000. But let's say that it was 800,000. What they don't tell you is that the Arab countries expelled 1 million Jews from their country. And when they did it, they took their lands, they took their houses, everything, to the tune of about $1 billion.
From Morocco, 261,000. From Algiers, 14,000. From Tunisia, 56,000. From Libya, 36,000. From Egypt, 31,000. From Yemen, 51,000. From Iraq, 130,000. From Syria, 5,000. From Lebanon, 6,000.
So the UN and a lot of people say that Israel owes those people that were tossed out of their country some. Well, then, if there was 800,000 tossed out and their land was taken, and the Arab countries tossed out 1 million Jews and took their land, why don't we just call it even? So let's move on to some stuff that's very interesting. Now, these people were moved into or left to go to these other countries to escape the war. Those countries have kept them on their borders in camps. Jordan is the only country that actually absorbed these people into their state when they took over in pre-67 war, in the 48 war, 49. Those people that were in the West Bank all became Jordanians. So that land became Jordanian land. And you'll notice the UN didn't at all complain about that. They didn't complain about the fact that the Jordanians expelled every Jewish person from the West Bank and from Jerusalem out. So they don't talk about that, and it did happen. But the point of this whole thing is, right now as it sits, these 800,000, 700,000 people have turned into 5.6 million people. Now, a refugee anywhere else in the world, the person expelled has the right to go back to their country according to law. But if you have a son or a daughter in that other country that you're in, that person, by law, is a member of that nation because they were born there. But the Arab nations refuse to allow that. And UNRWA, which is the UN Oversight Committee for the Palestinians, puts every single person born onto the list of refugees with the right to return. Every single person. They're not part of that country. No. They have the right to return. Some of these people don't even live in Palestine anymore. Some of them are multimillionaires living in America. They are still on the list because once you're on the list, you never come off the list. So third, fourth, and fifth generation people are on this list with the supposed right of return according to the UN. No other country, no other group of refugees is offered this right. It is exclusive to the Palestinians in that area. Very, very strange. Now, there's been some problems that are occurring right now, and so I want to give you a little of this to show you how the media is working on this. Yesterday, and if you're watching this video, it could be a lot later, so this Jerusalem Day was yesterday, May 9th, I believe. Hamas, which is in the West Bank, who took over. Now, Hamas, so that you understand, brought Sharia law into the West Bank. They are killing women, children, men, anybody who dissents with them. And strangely enough, the United Nations is keeping quiet about this. In fact, when they took over by violence, by war from the PLO, and they murdered 90 PLO people from the offices when they took them over. These are not good people in the first place. You would think the UN would have a problem with it. Yesterday, Hamas fired 150 rockets into Israel. Now picture this. Mexico decides to fire 150 rockets into the United States. What do you think the United States response would be? Do you think that they would casually sit back and fly in a couple of jets and blow up some targets? Or do you think that they'd go crazy? In fact, is there any country, if France tossed 150 rockets into Germany, or Germany into France, or anyone into any country, do you think they'd sit idly by and just bomb a few areas and then sit back? No. But Israel's expected to do this, 150 rockets. And then, when they do retaliate after 150 rockets get blown in and they go in and they do something about Hamas, the headlines the next day, oddly enough, read something like 21 Palestinians killed. But strangely enough, they don't mention the fact that 15 of those Palestinians were actually Hamas members. The other thing that they say is that 10 children were killed. That is a possibility. But what they don't tell you is that Hamas routinely builds their offices under schools or in hospitals or in areas so that they can use people as human shields. In fact, a lot of times they will take children, women, and people and move them into the offices knowing that the Israeli IDF is coming, and they will leave them there to die so that they can have good press. And it's horrifying, but people don't cover this, and you don't get to hear this. In fact, the IDF tries so much not to hurt civilians that they actually fly in and drop concussion bombs first to tell everybody to get out of a building before they do that. If somebody doesn't, it's because they can't. So you'll notice this next headline that we've got here says that the IDF retaliated after several rockets were launched into Israel. Now, I don't know where you come from, but where I come from, 150 rockets, that's not a few. So again, you can see how the headlines are skewed, and you need to watch the mainstream media because I don't know what their agenda is, but there is an agenda, and that will affect your finances one way or the other. If you're doing any investing in commodities and stuff like this, watch out. There is something going on behind the screen, and this is what worries me. Now, let's get to the part I promised. The part I promised for you is I was going to tell you something that would shock you. Remember, as I said, that Jordan owned the West Bank. Well, in 1988, Jordan, the king of Jordan, said, "We're out. Don't want the land anymore. The PLO can be in charge of it." This land never was a country, an autonomous country called Palestine. It was always under the Ottomans, then the British, then it was taken over by as I mentioned, Jordan became part of Jordan. Then in the 67 war, it was taken over by Israel and held. Now, the final map that we're going to pop up. The mainstream media keeps telling you that Israel's taking more and more of Palestine, the Palestinian land. They're not taking more and more of the Palestinian land. There was never a country called Palestine that was its own autonomous country. It was always a strip of land owned and taken over by somebody else. These areas, you can see the small areas that are Palestinian land. That was the amount of land that was offered to the Palestinian organization in the Oslo Accord. The Jews were willing to say, here, this area. Now, the Arabs, once again, gave one of these and walked out. So they never even took this area. It's still, by international law, because it was captured, it's actually Israeli land. And any time in a war that land is taken, it becomes part of the country that takes it. That's how it works on this planet. If you take that country over, you own that strip of land. Except here. And this is where it gets a little weird. So in 2000, Yasser Arafat, the guy for the head of the PLO, who, by the way, when he died, had $6.8 million in his bank account that he was skimming from UNRWA, who was putting money in that was supposed to go to the Palestinian people, was at the Camp David Accords. The then head of Israel offered 95% of everything that they asked for and $3 billion in reparations, and they could move their people back in. And without a counteroffer, Yasser Arafat stood up and walked out of the meeting. One of the princes of Arabia stopped him in the hallway and said, "What are you doing? This is everything you've asked for." And he said, "There will be no peace." And it makes you wonder, Bill Clinton, who was there at the time, Yasser Arafat later said to him, "You are a great man." And Bill Clinton responded to Yasser Arafat, "No, I am not. And you have made me that way." So here's my point to finish off. When you see one of these maps and you hear, as an example, well, let's toss this one up from MSNBC. You'll see how they're saying, this is slowly how the Jewish people have been stealing land from the Palestinians. That's not the truth. So when we switch back to this map here, this is the map from the Oslo Accord. This is what they were offering at the time, their offer that was turned down. This land had all, in 1967, been taken by the Jewish nation of Israel. Now, according to any law, they own all of it. It's theirs. And the fact that they're willing to give something to somebody else is shocking. But the world and the world courts have tried to make it look like anything built within that area of the West Bank is illegal. But here it is, and I'm going to say it one more time. Never have the Palestinian authorities or heads of the Palestinians ever accepted 1 acre of the land within that area. Ever. It's all Israeli land. It's all from Israel. So when you see this the next time, when you see this map go up on the screen, understand that this is a ploy. This land is Israel's land. It has never been anything but since 1967, because Jordan gave it up. Israel took it over. And that's the law. That's the law. So the question you have to ask yourself is, why are you continuously told that when they go into this area and build, it's illegal, when it's not, according to how the international law has worked for every other country? Why is Israel special? What's the end game? Pay attention. It will affect your finances.